coalitions that AFSC works with here in Chicago is the Move the Money Chicago Coalition, and we had a great event on Valentine's Day outside Durbin and Kirk's office, asking them to not break our hearts and cut all the programs that are being cut under sequestration. And that was a great example of peace groups, labor groups, community groups coming together in this ask. And our next speaker, Vince Emanuele, was part of that program. Vince is with Iraq Vets Against the War, and he's the Northwest Indiana chapter president. He served 2 tours with the U.S. Marines in Iraq, and he's also a host on the program, Veterans Unplugged. Will you please welcome Vince Emanuele.
So I'm assuming that most people here are against the wars. I'm assuming we don't have to go through why these wars are bad. And I was explaining to my friend Allison when we were coming here that in some ways, 10 years later, it's almost as if it's like being in a band trying to play like your original album. It's like, all right, now I'm going to talk about something that I haven't talked about. I've been involved doing this work for 7 years now. When I was 18, I joined the Marine Corps, I think in a very ignorant fashion, as a lot of Americans do. And then others, I think also there's economic needs, there's healthcare needs. It's very nuanced, and I think we should talk about that as well. But my father was right. I mean, he told me right away, he said, Vince, you know, are you crazy? My dad was from the southeast side, he comes from an Italian background, some bookmakers, some steel workers, some iron workers. My great-grandfather was in the Little Steel Strike in 1937. His best friend had a .38 revolver shoved in his mouth by a Chicago police officer, and he was asked whether or not he was a communist. My dad was in Grant Park in 1968. So that background was there, and although I was a smart, know-it-all 17-year-old, I still ended up joining the Marine Corps because I knew better than my 60-year-old father. When I was in the Marine Corps and when we were in Iraq, to talk about this 10 years later, initially it was cathartic. You know, I was doing events with Iraq Veterans Against the War. I came home and would talk about my experiences in Iraq, and a lot of it is very brutal. I mean, we tortured people. We shot at innocent civilians. We'd play around with dead corpses and take pictures with bodies. My best friend from Tinley Park, his name was, coincidentally, Kevin Clark from Tinley Park, as we used to call him. A good Irish kid from the south side. And, you know, we picked up his body after watching half of his brains and lungs fall out of his chest cavity. We used to drive around on the streets and, you know, run over these dead bodies that would have, you know, decapitated heads on the back of them, and people would be taking pictures and some people would be throwing up. That's what's going on right now. I know, I mean, there's a lot that I would like to talk to. I'd like to talk about the military-industrial complex. I'd like to talk about capitalism. I'd like to talk about labor. I'd like to talk about the prison-industrial complex. I'd like to talk about racism. I'd like to talk about misogyny. I'd like to talk about global warming. There are 1,000 issues. There's 1,000 issues that I would like to talk about, but I thought in this capacity, on this anniversary, I didn't want to prepare anything. I just wanted to get in a space with a bunch of people that I actually really respect. The first time I got emotional in a while at one of these. There's not a lot of folks out there who are remembering this event. Even some folks within IVAW give me crap sometimes, and definitely many of those I served with, when I often tell people that the reason I'm against these wars in American empire and American imperialism is not because necessarily what it's doing to our troops, and it's not necessarily because of what it's doing to our citizens. It's because I saw what it was doing to the people of Iraq. And I know that it's not only doing that to the people of Iraq, but it's doing that to the people of Palestine, to the people of Syria, to the people of Libya, to the people of Pakistan, to the people of Afghanistan, to the people of Guatemala, to the people of Honduras, and we could go on down the line. So what I would suggest... So what I would suggest when we're talking about this, you know, we're trying to talk about, as many have mentioned, how do we rebuild this movement? I think we have to be very clear that America is an empire. We can no longer go at this and say, well, now we're against this invasion, or meddling in Syria. Well, now we're against Libya. Well, now we're against it. No, we are against American empire. We're against the idea that America has 1,000 bases around the world and tries to control what the rest of the world does. And the more we frame it in that fashion, I think the more we'll get along with folks. I think the more folks will understand that. And I think if you put it in a historical context, people also understand it. Obviously, we don't need to tell people around the world. Talking about drones, and this I think is a little more technical too. I think we need to be ahead of the game here. I think it's not just drones. We have to talk about robotics technology. Technology is not simply going to stop if we indeed stop the policy of using drones. The Pentagon right now is working on weapon systems that include nanotechnology, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. By 2025, according to the Army, half of the armed forces will be autonomized, robots, by 2025. That's what the future looks like. The future looks like drones that are the size of mosquitoes and bumblebees. The future looks like drones that are going to operate much like what James Cameron produced during the Terminator films. As a matter of fact, when James Cameron was producing the Terminator films, he went to DARPA and asked DARPA, hey, can we look at some of what you're producing? He came back and subsequently said in 1992, they were working on things that we never even thought of using in the Terminator movies. This was 23 years ago now, 20 years ago. So I think, again, we need to be ahead of the game, and we need to not just oppose drone technology, but American empire. How does that connect to American capitalism? I know we're not going to have anyone here necessarily who's going to talk specifically about the climate. But look, folks, I mean, I don't know how much more serious I can be with this topic. Almost a year ago, a day before my birthday, NASA's top climate scientist, James Hansen, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called Game Over for the Climate. What he said was that if the Keystone XL pipeline is produced, and if we go through the remaining natural gas and coal deposits that are on the Earth right now, that at some point in the near future, we will have reached carbon levels that exceed that of the Pliocene era, which was 2.5 million years ago. During that period, sea levels were 50 to 60 feet higher than they are right now. That's the context that we should all, I think, keep in mind. So if I'm talking to people who are already committed, if I'm talking to people who are already doing this work, I've asked myself, have I done enough? Have I been arrested? Have I stood there and gotten my ass kicked by a police officer? Have I stood there in solidarity with my brothers and sisters who are getting their asses kicked by police officers? I've thought to myself, and I've talked to Michael Applegate about this, my friend in IVAW, why haven't I sat, and I'm not saying that this is what people should do or that this is what would work, but I think to myself, how committed am I to this? Am I willing to put my life on the line the next time an issue comes up, or if indeed we're going to work as a movement to stop American imperialism abroad? What am I willing to do for that? Am I really willing to give up my life for that? How much of my life am I willing to give up for that? I know the people I look up to gave their lives. When I look up to people like Malcolm X, when I look up to people like Martin Luther King, look up to people like Gandhi. And part of what Gandhi said was that if you weren't willing to stand and get your head cracked, or if you weren't willing to stand with me and march smilingly and willingly, quote, into a hail of gunfire, then I don't want you marching with me. I know those are high standards. I don't think I live up to those standards, but I look myself in the mirror every morning and I ask myself, what is it going to take to stop with drones and the use of drones? How can I contribute to the ongoing campaigns? How can I challenge my friends and family who aren't involved and get them into this room? We obviously need to connect with the Latin American and African American community in Chicago, particularly within the anti-war movement. These are gigantic communities in Chicago who I don't very often see at anti-war events. And I think we need to be critical of each other. I think we need to ask, are these strategies and tactics working? Can we do more? Should we be more militant? Should we be more pragmatic? Those to me are very nuanced, sophisticated questions, and I think they dictate nuanced and sophisticated answers. I think anybody who's going to stand up here, or anyone who would stand at another event and say that this is very simple and that this process is very clear-cut, I think is telling a lie. I think that this is very complex. And I think we need to be very serious with one another and constantly challenge each other. But then also, what I've learned through working with Iraq Veterans Against the War is to create a community. I mean, I've been to activist events before where people have said, hey, Vince, you ready for the revolution? I'm like, what's your last name? I don't even know. They're asking me if I'm ready for a revolution. And I'm saying, well, I mean, if we have a cup of coffee, maybe first, you know. With all of that being said, and I do want to add a little humor there, but I really want to be very serious when I say that I love everyone that's in this room. I am beyond pleased and honored that 10 years later there are people who are willing to remember this event and continue to struggle and continue to work. I mean, look at the folks who are in this panel and look at all of the folks who are out here and the kinds of work that you're doing. I honestly have to say that I'm very happy to be in this space, and I just want to share some of that love and solidarity with you.